My question is for David. In talking about the input of feed for your fish in your system, what is the source of your feed?
Is this thing working? In my system, I use the same feed everybody uses. I produce enough protein to replace that feed, but I don't have the time, money, or energy to actually do it. But if you had a big enough system, potentially the sunshine and nitrogen fertilizer could be the primary input.
But at this point, like you use corn, soybeans, or what?
I go down to the feed and seed and get a bag of feed.
Gotcha. Okay.
I'll say one more thing. I actually did feed a certain percentage of these animals brine shrimp that I grew in the tanks. But I didn't have a big enough system to replace all their feed. I was replacing like 5% of their feed. All I did was demonstrate that you can do it.
Next question in front here, Luis.
This one's for Hannah. I have a lot of friends who don't like going outside. They like the convenience of modern food. How would you propose for them to eat sustainably or green?
I would propose that they go outside more. It's something that every animal needs. And I think that they would probably feel better if they went outside more and maybe understand that it's not so bad. But otherwise, I do understand that not everybody necessarily has the time. I'm grateful for that. But there are forest farming systems. I mean, I understand that what I presented on is definitely less than 1% of food production right now. But if you calculate, I wish I pulled up the quote from Restoration Agriculture. He talks about how much food is being produced per acre on his farm as compared to a grain operation, let's say. And it is way, way, way above. I mean, these polyculture systems, I mean, if you go outside into the woods, there's food everywhere. You know, we can't do that if we try. So I also wanted to mention, too, as a response to that question as well, the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas, is in the process of perennializing cash crops. So that's another way that we can get out of this cycle of tilling and spraying, and we'll have deeply rooted systems, as Bob Kramer mentioned, and be producing grains in a way that is more sustainable. And that the Kernza grain from the Land Institute is one that I think is going to be on supermarket shelves soon.
So I really like this panel. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It was really good. And thank you, Dave, for bringing back the attention aquaculture deserves in terms of, because we don't often think about it. So I think that was really useful. So I have two sort of questions, and I'm going to ask them both. But I'm thinking about the first panel and about the healthy eating index that I think was it Dr. Fritchie brought up. And I want to, so I'm thinking about the issue of nutrient-dense foods versus total yield. And I think Kevin brought up some ideas about yield production that was necessary for the world's population. And I'm wondering if we thought about it in terms of nutrient density, if that would challenge how we think about future food production needs. And my second question is, of course, Naomi's presentation that made me slightly uncomfortable. Probably made a lot of people uncomfortable, which is good because that's always useful to put us out of our comfort zone. So I'm sitting here thinking, what does our emphasis? We hear a lot of emphasis on feeding the world, and the population's going to jump by 2050 and so on. So that when we have this term, feeding the world, and that's a rhetorical term, right? If I'm understanding it correctly. So what does that distract us from? I'm curious about. You were talking about it draws our attention to something or distracts it from, and so I guess that's kind of a big question, but I'm interested in that one too.
Do you have a preference as to which of those two questions we take first? They're really, really very different. Well, then I'll exercise the prerogative and ask Naomi to go first.
Okay. I think the question It's a great question. And one of the things that it might be emphasizing is what some entities can bring to the table and at the expense of others. So is it that multinational corporations have the answer and that we're not looking at other factors, or thinking about what kind of political factors might be involved as well, or what kind of indigenous knowledge would be lost by pursuing a solution that a multinational corporation is offering. So, you know, I think it can cause us to look in or suggest that, you know, that it's a one-size-fits-all solution when maybe there are lots of different solutions to feeding the world, and maybe those will come from different parts of the world, maybe not all from the U.S.
Does anybody else on the panel have a comment on that particular question, the feeding the world question? No? Yeah, Hannah?
I should clarify. When I said that in restoration agriculture, he mentions that he's producing more per acre. He actually clarifies that and says that more per acre is meeting all of his dietary needs. He's eating solely from his land, and he's not producing any grains.
Okay. And then the other question had to do, I'm sure I'm wildly paraphrasing and missing a lot, but about the notion of nutrient density as a consideration or a factor in the notion of yield.
Well, and how would that change how we think about this feeding the world? If we thought about nutrient density foods versus total yield, would that change anything?
So I wasn't here. The only panel I missed was the first one, so I don't know if it was Felix what he said. But you know, so I'm a scientist, so I look at refereed publications, things that have been published in the literature, and even more than that, I tend to focus on studies that look at mini studies, so studies of studies, meta-analysis, if you will, like some of which I presented today. And we only have 6 minutes, so I didn't go into it. But there's very similar information out there, similar to what I presented on the yield. The one thing that I would say to that is developing countries are eating better than they used to, and that enters into the whole equation of we'll be able to meet their dietary needs, is what you're basically getting at, I guess. And so I'm not any kind of authority on that subject, but there's plenty of information out there in the literature, and you know, I had a quick perusal of it. I planned to include several things that got cut out, and that was one of them. But I would say it's a very similar story, that if the trends come to fruition, we're not there.
Yes, in the back. Just wait for the microphone.
One of the things that I've heard more than once on our panels is the fact that we need to double our food supply in order to feed the coming populations. But I also know that we waste about 50% of the food that is produced, and that happens at all different levels of the food system or food delivery system, including the consumer. And I think it's interesting that I'd like to know your perspective on reducing waste and how that would improve our greenness.
Well, I'll just say mine, and anybody else can comment. I mean, obviously, yes, you're exactly right, and that's mostly a U.S. thing. We're very wasteful. We've got 1.8% of our population that could and does produce enough food for our population, but because of our waste and other things, you know, and of course we do export a good percentage of that as well. But obviously, I think that's a very good point that should enter into the conversation. I don't know what else to say.
Any other comments from the panel? I guess I would say that I have a slightly different understanding about just one minor point, and that is that it's mostly a U.S. thing. I think waste occurs everywhere in the world, but it occurs very differently, is my understanding. That in other parts of the world, the waste occurs much closer maybe to the production end of things, less so at the consumer side, but in storage or lack thereof and transportation and so forth. So it's a more pervasive problem, perhaps different in its manifestations.
I guess I would have a response.
Okay, and then we'll go to the gentleman in the back after you
Yeah,
respond.
sort of in response to your mentioning that it has a lot to do with on the production end. I think that's why staying more bioregionally specific can benefit us in that way too. The shorter the distances food travels, the less waste there. There are communities of 100 people or more that live off of food dumpstered from Whole Foods, organic food. So it's, diverting the waste stream can also happen. And principle of permaculture, produce no waste. Nature doesn't.
Gentleman in the back.
Yeah, just a point of clarification. Several people have referred to feeding the world in 2050, and I sense that some people interpret that as the U.S. feeding the rest of the world, and that's not the case. The world needs to feed 9 billion or 10 billion people in 2050. We are an important part of that, but that is not only the United States has to do that. And then I'm kind of curious about this nutrient-rich food question, Mary. So are you suggesting that there should be work in enhancing the nutritive quality of existing foods? Because the other part of that could be agricultural policy that supports certain crops while it doesn't support other crops that may be of higher nutrient value. So there's both a biological component to that as well as a policy component.
Mike has a question here in the front. Oh, while we're getting there, we'll have a comment from Naomi.
I just wanted to respond to the thought about feeding the world and about that responsibility being the U.S. I didn't mean to say that it is. I meant to say that it would seem to me that would be one way, one place that phrase could take us. Not that it is or should be that way. Yeah.
Mike?
Okay, two questions. Mainly for Bob, the photo you showed of the prairie grass strips in the field in Iowa, like what sort of policy exists currently, or what sort of policies would you craft or want to see crafted that would support that type of agriculture on a larger scale to be competitive with what's currently out there, in the current market with the system that we have right now?
Well, as I understand, there are already some policies out there that will support buffer strips, riparian buffers, and that kind of thing. I'm not all that familiar with situation in a prairie ecosystem. I would assume that there would be similar standards that could apply to that, but I don't really have that information. I think they're demonstrating that, in an ecologically based agriculture, if you will, that incorporation of those kinds of areas can enhance not only soil quality but water quality as well, and still have similar yields to, say, if it was completely devoted to, say, soybean or corn or whatever commodity crop that was involved at the time.
And my second question, if I can ask a second question, is mainly for Kevin, the quote that you put up about the amount of cars taken off the road based upon the gains, or I guess not putting out as much carbon through modern industrial or modern agricultural practices. Do you know what data were taken into account in terms of the production of the chemicals, whether it be it pesticides or herbicides, and those processes as well, from extraction to production?
Yeah, so, rather than show a graph with a bunch of numbers, I just quoted one of the things of their ultimate conclusions. It is based on a baseline level of 1996, which is the first year of Roundup Ready, our first GMO. And so it's just my understanding, and I have to go back and look through the paper, but it's just a bunch of calculations to get to that point of what is the norm CO2 emissions from vehicles compared to what we reduce as a result of our no-till practices. And it's not just no-till that they were looking at in that paper. They were looking at the adoption of biotech that led to no-till, less herbicides, less insecticide, less tillage, less trips of tractors across the acres, less gas. All these things kind of rolled up into an equation that they figured.
Other questions or comments? Yes.
Most of you understand that I spend a lot of my career with grasslands and grazing management. And I would like to make a comment, and not so much a question, but Hannah might like to comment. There are over 16 million acres of grasslands in Missouri. Maybe not quite that anymore since we've plowed up a lot of it and put it to corn and soybeans. But there's nearly 16 million acres of grasslands. It's a tremendous resource. We have grazing systems that are very close to some of the things that Hannah was talking about, very close to permaculture techniques. And so I would call your attention to what Hannah was talking about. Grasslands can be grazed and managed with very small inputs, economical harvest methods, and they do produce a tremendous amount of food. We have only scratched the surface of the utilization and management of grasslands in Missouri. And so that leads me to also comment on what Kevin pointed out. In that case, we need education, because a lot of the techniques that we know about that are proven are not used. And so education is also very important in the utilization and management of our Missouri grasslands. Thank you. Hannah, do you like to comment?
Sure. Well, I think one really great example of someone who's mimicking natural systems in a grazing manner is Greg Judy with Mob Density. Of course, there are a lot of people doing mob density grazing or management intensive grazing now. And in a natural system, before humans intervened and put fences around cattle, the herds would stay together more closely. And so what he's doing is that they stay together more closely. The system that is happening with the hooves in the soil and the dung beetles creates an ecosystem that supports faster grass regrowth and is supporting a more biodiverse prairie system. So yeah, that's just one example, but I'm with you. Thank you.
I think we have time for one last question or comment, if there is one. Yes, Luke?
Sorry not to beat a dead horse, but the nutrient density thing, Bob, do you have any comment on soil life and then the crops' nutrient density or lack thereof changing with soil health, soil life over time?
Well, that's a good question, and the problem there is that there's not enough research studies on that have been done yet. There's been a few isolated examples, with strawberry, these kinds of things that what was reported was improved soil quality, if you will, improved the nutrient density of that particular crop. But that's, these are the types of things that need to be repeated, and I'm not so sure if there's a lot of funding out there that would do that. These are the kinds of things you know, we're trying to do in some situations, but, you know, it's primarily for looking at food crops, fruits and things like that, these types of so-called sustainable systems would support. But, you know, I think the jury's out on that yet, as far as improving nutrient density with improved soil quality, which, you know, is just a concept that's been tossed around just within the last 30 years.
All right, with that, I think I will say just a couple of words. One, please do fill out and turn in that handout. Secondly, please do come to next week's panel if you can. It'll look a little bit different from what we've been doing, but it's really a very important part of what we're doing, trying to synthesize and pull this all back together. We hope to have a very robust and open discussion during that panel that will be in a different location. So don't come to this room, please, or to this building. Please go to the new Student Center, to the Leadership Auditorium, which I believe is on the second floor in that building. That's where we'll be. So I hope we'll see you then. If you want to see the slides from today's panelists or any of the others, I think they're available on the Mizzou Advantage website. Is that right? Or will be. Today's aren't yet, but will be. And with that, we have some good food in the back of the room provided by Restaurant Blue.